If you scroll through LinkedIn enough, or if you Google leadership skills, or if you sign up for some leadership webinar, you'll inevitably find some list of things that will supposedly make you a great leader. Assertiveness, confidence, delegation, empathy, accountability, all of those tend to show up depending on how long the list is. And throughout 2020, adaptability and agility have understandably been promoted as crucial traits for people leading others through uncertain and at times even fearful conditions. But at all times, and no matter how long or short the list is of leadership traits, you will almost always find communication towards the very top. Because an ability to clearly and succinctly articulate one's thoughts is perhaps the most common trait found among history's most successful leaders. Because even if you possess every other leadership skill imaginable, they might not do you any good if they aren't communicated to others in some way. Because if you can't communicate your skills, then it's just as if you have some great new piece of technology but lack any way to communicate its value to potential customers, meaning that the technology isn't going to generate the revenue it should. And if you're a job seeker who has a stellar work history but you can't communicate it clearly and concisely in a resume or an interview, you've severely reduced the odds of landing a job that you may be perfectly suited for. And while the world has more ways than ever for people to communicate with each other, there's one form of communication that has been and will continue to be far more important than any other form of communication, no matter how many phone calls and Zoom sessions and Snapchats and TikToks and water cooler conversations you may experience. And that all-powerful communication tool that supersedes all other forms of communication is the written word. Yet it's incredibly easy with so much else going on around us to forget how reliant we are upon the written word. And it's also easy to forget how much of our lives are actually spent writing. And if you forget how important and inescapable writing is, then you might not realize how much your writing directly impacts both your personal and professional success. And in today's conversation, you're not going to learn how to write better, and you're not going to start sending more emails instead of simply picking up the phone, and you're not going to be encouraged to avoid all-important face-to-face or at least camera-to-camera conversations, but you will hear about the incredibly positive impact that a heightened focus on writing can have on individuals, organizations, and industries looking to translate their true potential into proven, purposeful, and profitable results. Hello and welcome to the Energy Detox, a petroleum-based blend of leadership conversations guaranteed to boost your professional and personal output by flushing away the hidden and often toxic barriers to peak performance. I'm your host, Joe Sinnott, a chemical engineer, executive coach, and 15-year energy industry veteran, helping you tap into the same resources fueling today's most successful and sustainable leaders. And today, we're going to discuss why many of those leaders place such a high priority on written communication, and not just on written words that go out as company-wide communications with their signature pasted at the bottom, or that are read as speeches or video presentations, but why successful leaders place such a high value on all internal and external written communication that emanates from within their organizations. And while I enjoy writing and have at times joked that I feel more like I perhaps should have gotten an English degree instead of an engineering degree, the reality is that whatever writing talent I have or think I have pales in comparison to professional writers who use their skill with the quill to impact the world in a way that a million text messages, LinkedIn posts, and hastily written emails from an average Joe like me never could. So that being said, for today's episode, I'm turning to someone who was, in fact, an English major and who successfully uses the power of writing to support an industry filled with engineers and other technically minded folks. And through his work, this person bridges the gap between technical jargon and non-technical audiences, while also strengthening the connections between energy industry leaders and their varied stakeholders. And that person is Stephen Forrester, Content Development Manager at Gyrodata, whose efforts have led to tangible increases in both the profitability and sustainability of the organizations he's been a part of, and who so generously has agreed to join me for today's discussion. So, Stephen, after that long-winded introduction that you undoubtedly could have articulated far better and more concisely than I did, please allow me to welcome you here to the Energy Detox.
Morning, Joe. Thanks for having me on today. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Stephen. And hopefully you're still saying that at the end of our conversation today, which I want to kick off with an important question that may help establish a level of honesty and integrity and transparency between you, me, and anyone else who's listening to this conversation. And that question flows from the last episode of the Energy Detox, where I admitted to extensive use of CliffsNotes during my high school career. And that had me thinking this morning whether you, as someone with multiple English degrees, also relied upon CliffsNotes at any point in your esteemed academic career.
Well, so in the interest of being honest here, in high school, I have indeed used CliffsNotes. That was probably when my love of reading and writing as foundational skills that would carry me forward was really manifesting in the biggest way. But at the same time, I was a teenager and I had a lot of things I wanted to do. I got a job, my first job when I was 15. So I also worked several days a week at a restaurant. And sometimes it was just a little easier to go on and find the summary and the key points and themes that I needed to quickly understand for the class the next day. I would say that in college it kind of shifted because, especially with my major and in my master's degree, the material we were reading got increasingly obscure, and so at that point there just were no cliff notes. I studied French poetry and French literature. My primary area of focus was British Romanticism, and dabbled a little in some other world literatures like Japanese lit, for example. And so that kind of stuff, there's nothing. I mean, you're lucky to find the Wikipedia page for some of this stuff. So at that point, it was really, really necessary to dig my heels in and commit to the study and learning and reading and all that. So, but hey, guilty as charged, especially as a younger person needing to really maximize my time usage and also just being kind of a teenager wanting to hang out with friends and do other things.
All right. Well, I appreciate the honesty of your answer. And I guess if I'm hearing things correctly, for those who major in English, you're not just rereading Lord of the Flies and Moby Dick, just with like some heightened sense of literature and hypercritical nature. It sounds like you move on to slightly more obscure and grander pieces of literature than those. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, especially if you take, for example, in high school, an AP or IB English classes, and you can place out if you're a pretty decent reader and writer, which the standards aren't incredibly ridiculous or anything at that point. And so if you place out when you test, you can skip a lot of that early English 101 type stuff at the university where they're going over kind of simple grammar and syntax and a lot of those, like you mentioned, a lot of those texts that are really, they're more almost things that you would read in high school, like A Tale of Two Cities. I think we read that in ninth grade, for example. So, but you might see that in an entry-level English course at a university. So if you can place out, you can start off immediately in a subject area. And I wasn't able to focus my core study until my master's degree. So a lot of the other courses in my undergrad were just individual courses that I would take and see if I liked it. So I did American Lit and I did French Lit and I did British Romanticism. And British Romanticism, that professor he became one of my mentors and a big advocate for my kind of personal and professional development. And so I stuck with that as my path. And that's when you get really deep into the kind of Wordsworth and Byron and Keats and Shelley and the whole gang. And there's some information on all of that sprinkled about on the internet, but not the kind of analysis and things that we were needing to do. You couldn't get that out of simple summaries. You really needed to read and formulate your own opinion. So yeah, I'd say definitely after you move past high school and you'll get into some stuff that will definitely help broaden your mind and really open some new kind of doors and build your intellect and whatnot.
So lesson learned here. One, if I'm going to start with a smart ass question, I need to be ready for a thorough answer from an English major. Two, I think, other than maybe sprinkling in some talk of efficiency when you were explaining maybe the motivation behind leaning on CliffsNotes in your high school career, there's probably not a lot of words you just used that would be typical of an oil and gas podcast. I think I heard something about syntax and grammar and a number of people that I've heard of but haven't read. So all that being said, I think if there was any question that you do indeed represent perhaps maybe an outlier in our industry, I think let me ask you. So clearly you're an English major. I think, again, you just proved that with the last couple minutes of what you just shared. So how the heck did you wind up in oil and gas? I mean, why are you here? Why are you working for Gyrodata? And why are you contributing to an industry that, again, would typically not lean all that heavily upon everything you just described?
Sure. Well, part of my inspiration when I was younger was a more cliche in that it was a family thing. It was my dad. He was in oil and gas. He was actually in the industry for about 40 years prior to his recent forced early retirement. But I had at least a peripheral interest in it from a young age, and I thought it was really interesting and neat, and admittedly drawn to some of the other kind of visible components as far as it's high tech and it's incredibly successful and it pays well and things like that were really kind of common knowledge even in people that didn't have much connection to the business. As I went through college and my master's, and I kind of came to this point. I was in the service industry since I was, like I mentioned, I was 15. I was a couple months before I turned 16. I got my first job, and so I'd been waiting tables and floor manager and things like that for quite some time. And I got the master's degree, and then I kind of thought, well, I don't really know what to do with this. I just know that I don't want to teach. I had done I had done student teaching at my alma mater at Bel Air High School, and I'd had a great semester and met a bunch of fantastic young people. And my mentor, he had been my English teacher when I was in 10th grade, so it all kind of came full circle, and it was great, and I loved it. And then I kind of realized that at the same time that it just wasn't for me, because I was being presented with this perfect world where all these AP kids were getting A pluses on everything, little geniuses, and the disparity between that and the actual educational world, especially at urban and lower income schools, things like that, was enormous. And I was more of, let me teach at Bel Air or Lamar or DeBakey or HSPVA, these high ranking local high schools. And my first placement was in a school that had it was actually on the fringe of the district. It was 40 miles from my house, and it had a fail rate of going on 70%. So that was when I saw that the nobility was not in me to be to be a teacher. I just realized I was going to do it just to make money instead of actually being passionate about it. So kind of faltered around a little bit and wondered what I could do, and still had this interest in oil and gas. And through kind of a lucky break, I connected with a recruiting agency that had an entry level position as a technical editor. They called it something else. It was called a deliverables coordinator, which always kind of confounded me as a job title. But it was a technical editor working on these reports for subsea blowout preventer inspections, and this was right after Deepwater Horizon, Macondo, the big blowout. So this was a real focus area for the industry. So I started there. This was at Lloyd's Register. It was the energy drilling division, which had kind of just been formed from two acquisitions, and was there for about a year. Moved on to National Oilwell Varco, and really got to see the entire company started out and more of on the downhole sensors and drilling dynamics tools side, and then kind of moved on to really just writing about everything at the entire company, even dipping my toes in some investor relations and quarterly earnings and things like that. And I was there about 5 years and moved on over to Gyrodata. A friend of mine and former NOV colleague was the manager, marketing manager over here, and she brought me on, and we had some good conversation. And I joined in November last year, and I've made it. I've survived so far, so yay!
So happy to hear you survived, obviously. I'm guessing along the way, though, there's been some challenges being maybe a non-technical person working in a technical industry and with technical professionals and writing about technical things that you might not have been exposed to. Is that a safe assumption, or am I just making up stories here and assuming what it might be like to be in your shoes?
No, it's definitely it's definitely and unfortunately a safe assumption, especially really early in the career. When I started at NOV, the initial resistance resistance was incredibly high. And not, I don't mean on my direct team and my supervisor, and I had amazing support and mentorship, but just from kind of organizationally, this concept of writing as a massive, value driver was just not there. And so you constantly got these questions of, well, why should we do this? Is it worth the time to do this? I don't have time to do this, but you don't know enough about it to write about it either. So I guess we just won't do it. There was a lot of kind of doubt and hesitation around dedicating business hours to this when people like product line managers and engineers and even salespeople, business development, they're either working on the back end on trying to make and design things that will generate revenue, and the other people are trying to actually go out there and use existing stuff to generate revenue. So it was hard to kind of break in and really say, no, look, this has value because of XYZ, whether it was equipping a salesperson with the tools they needed to go to a customer and say, well, look, I have this amazing case history, or, oh, you need the spec sheet? Well, here's 3, which one do you want? Or from a visibility stance, putting things in magazines as far as editorials, making sure you hit the SPE papers and conference presentations, things like that. So it was tough and took some time, but once I kind of identified people that would be champions and kind of be advocates and would really dedicate the time to not only helping me write and develop things, but also helping me learn, because that was one of my major objectives was, I don't want to be a guy that's just putting words down on a page. Really, anybody can do that. I mean, you can find anybody that can just regurgitate existing stuff. What I wanted to do was really study and learn the technology and what we did and get as good of an understanding as I could being a non-technical person. I'm not going to be able to talk about mathematical formulas and physics and downhole physics and burst pressure and casing and things. I mean, I'm never going to be able to get 100% in the weeds like that, but my desire was I want to, at the bare minimum, be able to intelligently converse with people about this topic. And especially if I help write an article or something like that. And kudos to NOV and my management for letting me be a bylined author on this stuff, even though I wasn't an engineer, because at the end of the day, they saw that I was, for example, I might get something like a PowerPoint, 120 slide PowerPoint, and then I would turn that into a 2,000 word article, basically by myself. And so they kind of saw that a person that's doing that, just because you're not an engineer, that doesn't mean that you can't be included as an author on there. Definitely not the only one, because I don't need people coming to me with questions about it and trying to buy things, because then I'm just going to have to refer them back anyway. But at least to build a portfolio and help myself be visible and gain some kind of traction in this business. And going back to your first question, overcoming those challenges and being someone that becomes a trusted voice that people can rely on, that they come to with their problems and their messaging needs. And I found that through the 7 years that I've been doing this, the challenges are still there at times, but it's become a lot better. I've made it, quote unquote, so to speak, and that people aren't really so defiant about writing anymore. Once you kind of get it out there and give them the proof and this works, and it's a viable business tool, once you get them on board, it's a whole other ball game. And you have that support, the possibilities expand quite a bit.
I think that's good color on certainly, one, your understanding of the fact that you're going to have to get up to speed from a technical standpoint and dive in. It's also good insight on how, it sounds like jumping in, though, maybe you didn't anticipate having to be such an advocate for writing. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't really know what what I expected. When I went to, I kind of always started NOV because LR was really just, there was a writing component, but it was a lot more editing. And so really I didn't get into the writing as much until I started NOV. And I would say that starting there and jumping into it, I knew next to nothing about what I was going to be writing about. I'd went from subsea BOPs and pressure control equipment and predominantly offshore stuff to downhole drilling dynamics and some kind of commodity instrumentation products and pressure gauges and hook load sensors and things like that, and drilling optimization, drilling automation. I had no idea. I mean, I knew nothing. And so the first order of business was even to just dive in and familiarize myself with what we even did to try and write effectively about it. I had a kind of trial by fire because because I started at NOV in a December, and my whole team went on vacation immediately thereafter because our vacation didn't roll over. So we had people vanishing for two weeks in December, myself included for most of my time there. But I was kind of left to my own device, and someone came to me and asked for I think it was like a 7 or 8 page brochure cataloging all these different products from this certain brand name, and then talking about intercompany sales, and it was pretty brutal. And I had very little support, and I just had to kind of do this thing, and I actually did it successfully and learned a whole lot in the process. And from there, I just said, okay, now that I kind of get it, what do we have and what can we do? Because the business I was in was kind of a new thing that NOV was doing at that point. They were bringing together some legacy stuff with some shiny new things, and forming a business that focused on what I mentioned with drilling dynamics and drilling optimization, automation. And that was the challenge, was they don't really have a lot. They have some historical brands that have immense market equity, like MD Taco, Martin Deckard Taco, for example, that had been around for 60, 70, 80 years type things, and product names that had enormous value in the market, but no one had been there to tell the story of any of this. And that was what I was tasked with doing, was building that out and telling that story and documenting successful projects and via case histories and articles, and really helping get the word out that this existed and that it was awesome and it was cool, and you should want it. You want it on your rig too, please.
So it sounds like, I mean, obviously them leaning on you and your various roles and responsibilities as a storyteller has provided value. And it sounds like people are seeing that, fortunately. But, you're not the only one communicating. You're not the only one telling stories of the company. So I guess I'm curious, have you encountered anyone, whether they're leaders or salespeople or anyone that you've worked with, who maybe thought they were decent writers and, thanks to working with you or seeing what you've outputted or maybe getting your feedback, have discovered that maybe their own writing could be vastly better and maybe that they're leaving some value on the table? Have you had those instances where they say, wait a second, Steven can't do everything for us. I need to do some of this myself, but maybe I don't have the skill level that I thought I did, or certainly don't have the skill level that could generate more revenue. I mean, bottom line results better than what they had been. Have you had examples of that in your career so far?
Yeah, and I'd actually, I'd really take it in two ways, and definitely on the front end, as far as working with people and them kind of realizing that as a limited resource, there's only so much I can do. And I've found people that they've had to bear more of the burden for whatever reason. Maybe I'm limited on time, or I have another thing I'm doing, or whatever. And then I've said, maybe you can do a first draft, or at least get me a paragraph or a summary or an outline or things like that. And then I would get a draft back that was actually pretty well written. And I know there's the kind of generalization that engineers aren't good writers or communicators or whatever. And I've seen examples of that. And I've also seen examples totally on the opposite, where I've been incredibly surprised to find that there's been people that they can write exceptionally well. And I'm certainly not the best writer ever or anything like that. I'm not this paragon of writership, but I even to the level that some of them, like you said, I've went back and said, if you can do this, I mean, I still want to help you and I still want to write articles with you, but maybe you need to deal more with customers, or maybe you need to help maybe you're an engineer and you need to help your product line management team make presentations, to where they had this kind of inbuilt talent that they didn't even really realize was there. So that's definitely happened, and probably less on the leader side. I mean, I've admittedly not worked with too many really high level folks, but the ones I have, I mean, at NOV, I worked with the CEO, Clay, and the CFO, Jose Bayardo. And when I was kind of involved with some of the earnings script writing and cataloging notable achievements for the earnings reports, things like that, these guys are exceptional writers. I mean, they're really good, and their problem is they just don't have time to do that, but their writing is very good. And so that became the challenge of working with folks like that, is, how can you write a speech that will sound exactly like someone like that in a very short time frame, and knowing very little about how they actually sound. That it was actually one of the hardest things I had to do, and also one of my favorite things, because that was really taking me out of my comfort zone and saying, you have 4 business days for me and one other person. There was an investor relations manager. Here's a blank piece of paper. You have 4 days to write a script for these 2 guys to read for an earnings report before they get to the live Q&A. And I'd say 50% of the time we'd write something and we'd send it to the big bosses, and it would come back totally obliterated. I mean, no resemblance to what was sent, because they had their own style and I have my own style, and we all kind of have our own way, and trying to emulate that is very difficult. Like I said, if you work with somebody effectively 4 times a year, how into their head can you get with how they write? And a couple times, here and there, I mean, we got some back that were barely changed, and this had this feeling of elation, like, yes, we did it. So I would say that's kind of on the one side, and then on the other would be, even I've had instances of working with people where I've kind of found shortcomings or faults in my own kind of writing that have been revealed to me that have allowed me to grow as a writer. I mean, actually, my first boss, NOV, his name was Jason Hedgepeth, and he was just like the grammar and syntax god. I would send him Skype messages and, oh yeah, so this comma goes here, right? Or so if you use an M dash here and the clause that follows, the really nitty gritty grammar stuff. And I was kind of a write by feeling kind of guy. I just wrote and watched the magic happen and hoped it was good. So having someone to help build up and really find those small errors, but things that people can catch and see, and that was really important kind of in my early development, was breaking out of the kind of naive belief that my style was just acceptable as it was, and that there was no need to kind of adapt or change. And then, oh wait, this isn't perfect out the gate. There's definitely things you can learn. And I mean, to this day, I'll still reach out to him on Teams or Skype or whatever every once in a while and just say, hey, does this sentence sound good? Yeah, it sounds good to me, but my style is very long-winded. I like long sentences with lots of commas and clauses, and I'll go to the end of time with this stuff. It's very informed by like Proust or Faulkner. And that's really not great stuff for oil and gas, right? That's not going to work. And so you're trying to get to the point as quickly as possible. You see a lot about how concise and things need to be succinct and all that. And so I read these really short, kind of punchy sentences, and it feels like something's wrong with it to me. I'm like, can we put a comma in there? Like, let's add a comma and a conjunction and join these things. They're 2 ideas that need to be together. But that required me to kind of reevaluate how I wrote in my educational world and in my personal life, and then versus, what I needed to do to adjust to the industry I'm in, and really how technical people consume content, which is much more kind of short form, punchy things that they can digest easily and quickly, instead of really getting into this, long-winded style. So I had to learn too, but I was better for it. So I was really thankful to have, an early career mentor like that could help me push my writing to the next level.
So I think you did a good job there of, one, introducing some humility into things, and again, recognizing that stylistically there's a time and a place for long-windedness and a time and a place for more concise, punchy things. I also thought that was very nice of you to concede perhaps that high-level leaders in many cases are, maybe instinctively good writers and communicators, even if they don't have the time to do it. But I need to ask you now, with all of these lessons learned, and certainly, where you're at in your career, certainly, given the educational background you've had, you must be on the lookout for things that really, sort of make you raise your eyebrows or shake your head, in these professional writings, maybe people in similar situations as you that are banging out from other companies, or even just, day to day reading a newspaper article or looking at a billboard. So, I got to ask you, are there specific things or themes that stand out to you and you just say, oh my, that's terrible. And, that's not going to land. And that's, who let that go out the door? Are there situations like that you see now, especially given your professional career?
I do. It's a fun life to lead, where everything you see is ripe for for being criticized. But as far as general stuff like a billboard or newspaper or an ad or something like that, especially if it's something I see driving or out or whatever, I always will say, oh, they're missing a comma there, or the big one is hyphen. The hyphens are just a confusing thing, I think, and so I'll always see things with missing a hyphen in this or that scenario. I'll watch the news sometimes at night, and I'll see things like 24-hour report, and there's no hyphen between 24 and hour for things like that, where the two words modify the one that comes after it, so you need to hyphenate it. Just stuff like that. Where does anyone really care? I mean, probably not, right? There's probably no one else except people like me. And it's funny because if anybody's around me, I'll say, just so you know, there's supposed to be a hyphen right there. It's like, all right, what am I gaining from doing this? But I can't help myself. And yeah, in the business sense, definitely, and again, kind of shamefully, but when I get like industry publications, for example, the World Oils and JPTs and things like that, especially back when I was at NOV, I mean, we would actually, me and some of my colleagues, we would have our little ad review. We actually had an ad wall of shame that we put up, although admittedly it was more on the design side than the copy side. But even some ads where we'd review and just kind of look at them and say, what is this trying to say? Or, why did they name the product this name? It doesn't make any sense. Or, why does this ad only have one sentence on it? I don't even understand what I'm supposed to get out of this. And it was interesting to see different perspectives in kind of Marcom, and especially being my kind of perspective on marketing communications was I never even really considered myself a marketer, which might seem kind of counterintuitive given the career path, but I always wanted to be more on the technical side, and I wanted to understand what we were doing, understand how we made money, how does what we do in Marcom enable revenue generation. So I was never one for gimmicks or cheesy language and ridiculous headlines, especially in oil and gas. I mean, my opinion was we need to just tell the value story in accessible language and just put it out there. And even at NOV, I was sometimes challenged by that because I was part of a very large creative team, and there were widely differing opinions on that, right? Let's make ads that are really, really creative and that don't have much copy on the page. And it's like, how does a customer know what we're trying to sell? Well, they'll just get it. If they don't like the picture, they'll just keep on scrolling by. And sure, that's somewhat valid, but if you don't explain what they're seeing, they're not going to take anything away from it, right? Where's the call to action? Where's the something that's going to inspire them to actually act on what they've seen? So it's been a fun journey, but I try not to be overly critical, especially of direct colleagues. I don't really, unless someone reports to me, which I had a couple reports for all of 6-8 months or something before I went to Gyrodata. So and they were both already friends, so it's kind of awkward and weird. And other than that, and providing some kind of advice if I saw something glaringly obvious for people I'm directly kind of connected to. I avoid being overly critical unless it's just really, really bad or something that really clearly needs correction. But most of the folks that I'm working with nowadays, they welcome the ability to send something in a very kind of bullet point, short format and receive something back that's fully written out. So there's no fighting or resistance to that.
Nice. And that sounds like a little bit more positive of an experience than, say, redlining everyone's email that you receive and turning it around and telling them all of the various mistakes they made. I think that sounds like a nice
only my email,
kind of
only mine. I'll go through those things and just reread them, and I'm thinking, my God, did I not start this 15 minutes ago? But a lot of times for my emails, I realize I have a habit of being very kind of overly nice or deferent in what I'm saying, and I have a lot of pleases and things like that. And then I'll go back and I'll just say, well, why am I doing this? I don't need to kowtow before this person that I'm emailing to, and so I'll go back and I'll edit them to be more confident or aggressive versus the overly mousy style, which I think a lot of people, that's kind of their first thing. You've probably heard of the famous sandwich style messaging where you have to start with a sentence that has an exclamation point, and then you put your serious comment in the middle so they know you mean business. And then after that, you put another sentence with an exclamation point so you end on a happy note. It's like, so I've seen quite a bit of that, but that's something I always encourage people to do, is if you are going to kind of go back and review, just realize, which is relevant to everybody, right, is realize your audience and adjust kind of your style or your tone accordingly.
Well, I appreciate the color on that, because I think what I heard you say is that even in your day-to-day sending emails out to people, it sounds like it might take you more time than it might take someone else, even though, again, you write for a living, essentially, you communicate for a living, but yet it sounds like maybe there's some extra time and energy that you're going to put into an email that might wind up the same length as someone else, but maybe has a little bit more to it. Is that fair? I mean, does it does it take you longer basically to send an email or post on LinkedIn or shoot a text message to people? Or are you cursed by your background, if you will, and your perception? And
yeah, probably. I mean, on emails, sometimes it's very simple. Other times it requires a lot of kind of back and forth where I'll read it and I'll say, oh, I could say this a little differently, or there's a better way to do this, or why am I being, so like I said, why am I being so overly nice and mousy in this, where I'm emailing someone that's in the same hierarchy as I am, and I'll be a little perhaps too critical. And on LinkedIn, and when I post on there, I definitely go through multiple times before a post makes it to the to where it's live. And that's really less that I'm hypercritical of myself and more that I'm trying to find a way to word it that will maximize the visibility of the post with the LinkedIn algorithm. Hitting certain words and tagging people and tagging maybe companies that are involved and hitting the relevant hashtags and things like that, where it can have a massive difference in post visibility. If I was actually just talking to some of our guys about this the other day, for example, if you get people to comment on it, right? I mean, I that's probably fairly common knowledge, but I had one where, and it was a good post. I was pretty satisfied with it, and it got something like, I don't know, 1,200 views or something like that, right? And then another post, I tagged a guy in there because I had written this article, or really I'd done a Q&A with him, and I tagged him, and he was the co-founder. His name's Sid Gupta. He's a co-founder of this company called Nesh that has a conversational AI kind of chat bot for oil and gas. So it's really neat. But I had done this Q&A, and I tagged him, and he's well known. He's a former Schlumberger guy, former Shell guy, lots of connections, turned entrepreneur, huge network. And I tagged him, and he commented on it, and the thing got like 5,000 views, and it skyrocketed just because he added the comment. And I mean, ultimately, do the views matter or whatever? Yeah, really, no. Sometimes it's just validation that that I actually have a network that enjoys what I post. But yeah, that's more on the social media side, is how can I write this in a way that'll engage people and actually make them interested versus passing over it. And I think that my opinion on LinkedIn posting is probably not the same as a lot of people's, but I really kind of don't like what's colloquially been called the broetry style posts, where they have these little short sentences and then there's a forced line break between them. There's like 40 of them, and it just goes down and down and down forever. And it's like, I lost the job. I went in for the interview, but then I did such and such. And it's these little tiny things. It's just that it drives me nuts, because maybe as an English guy, I don't understand why people can't read a paragraph. Let's make it a paragraph, guys. I mean, that's how writing works. But that format was popularized, and so now it's everywhere. It's ubiquitous, right? And I just see it nonstop, and a little part of me just kind of groans when I see that kind of stuff. Even if the post is good, right? I mean, even if the content of it is actually solid once I read through it. But the formatting and the whole kind of baiting to get people to keep reading down and figuring they'll read little short sentences all the way down instead of just a paragraph. I find it a little frustrating. So that's why almost all of my posts, I do things like I write professionally and personally. It's a paragraph. I hope you can read it. I hope you can make it through a paragraph. If not, we're in trouble. So,
well, I got to be honest. I think I led you on that question, and you gave the answer that I was expecting, or at least I should say, hoping for, because the question probably reveals some insecurities that I have, because I tend to blather on. I tend to lend towards longer, full paragraphs, as you point out. With a clear, opening sentence, middle, and end. But I do still question when I put more time than maybe I should into, again, an email or a text message or a LinkedIn post. Does it matter? What's the value? And you touched on some of this very early on in convincing people that, when you have a message that's more clear, when you have something that can be conveyed to your audience so that they can understand it and they can understand the technology that you're doing, clearly that's going to add value. But what do you tell people? And again, it could be on a personal side, it could be on LinkedIn posting, but more importantly, on the work that you do, what do you tell people who say, does it really matter? Does it really impact the bottom line? Does it make a difference? Are we wasting all of this time, even if it's just Steven's time? Are we wasting all of this time putting this stuff together if it's not going to make a material difference to the bottom line? How, to the extent you run into people that are still skeptical, how do you respond to them?
Yeah, I mean, and you do. I certainly do from time to time, and I would hazard that most kind of people in similar spots, whether they're copywriters or comm specialists or managers or things like that. I'd say that kind of all of us are experiencing at least some resistance, especially in the current kind of market climate. Right. We have a job that's frequently considered overhead and we don't directly contribute to revenue. So first of all, my take is that definitely has value. And while it's not always quantifiable, right, in some kind of dollar amount of ROI for my salary versus what I generate, there are clear examples that I've really seen throughout my career of the writing that we do directly leading to sales. And so my thought was, for example, at NOV, I mean, we had a paper I wrote with some guys, mostly in Norway at the time, and it was about a sliding sleeve, completion technology that we had, and they had kind of deployed it on some north wells to prove the viability of the system, and it was great and saved money and time and all, life's good. So we published this thing, and then an engineer actually emailed, and she was in New Zealand, I think, somewhere way on the other side of the planet, and said, "Hey, I read this article in such and such magazine. I think we used a similar system a few years back, but I'm really curious if this, what's the difference between that one and this one? Because if this one is materially better, we have an 8-well campaign where I think this would be a really great fit. Who can I talk to about this?" So you think, okay, well, if that inquiry led to a sale, and therein is the challenge, is I personally don't always find out if it leads to a sale because I'm not involved in the conversation. But if an inquiry like that leads to a sale, it's going to make hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it's paid and potentially more, right? So it's kind of paid my salary. It's paid my salary alone for years. Just if one article or piece of marketing communications, collateral or whatever, if anything I do generates even one sale, and I can think of many. I don't want to say many. That's kind of exaggeration, but I can think of probably 4 or 5 times in my admittedly short career where we've had folks where I've at least been aware that they've reached out after we've written an article and said, I saw this, I'm really interested. Who do I talk to get pricing? Things like that. Most of them at NOV, but even at Gyrodata, we had one, I think it was, I don't know, a few months back, and someone from Exxon, I think, reached out and said, hey, I read this article, just curious to learn more about the technology and possible implementation, what could be the benefits, blah, blah, blah. So maybe it doesn't lead to a sale. That's fine. Yeah, maybe it just builds interest. That's kind of my base level scenario where I say, hey, it's just it's visibility, especially for a small company like Gyrodata, right? How many people outside of the niche we operate in, which is really wellbore surveying, how many people know about what we do? I mean, I worked in the industry for 6 years. I never even heard of a gyro in my life. I mean, other than your typical spinning gyro like you might see on Wikipedia or whatever. But I had no idea these things were used in oil well surveying, no idea about ellipses of uncertainty and well positioning and all that stuff. I mean, and I was decently well informed. So how do we get this out there, right? How do we get people to not only learn about this, but to be interested in it and want to run this kind of thing and the benefits of doing so versus maybe some other options or conventional technologies and whatnot. And so a lot of stuff that we'll do, either written or even some of the kind of more visual or audio, like a podcast or an interview, for example. We're doing an SP Live later this week, which this recording will come out after the fact. But that, for example, maybe it won't generate revenue, but we'll have people on there to listen in to find out what we do and how these technologies work and how they can potentially create value for that customer or for a potential customer that might not have known that we do wellbore tortuosity analysis or things like that. So that would probably be my main argument is to anybody I talk to at a company I work for is visibility is the prime or kind of as the bottom level objective, and then hopefully some kind of inquiry or sale thereafter. And even if it's not published in a magazine or editorial type, even if I write a case history and we give it to a sales guy and he takes it out to somebody and says, look, we got this new project. This was awesome. And the guy says, oh, hey, no kidding. This is amazing. Tell me more. So there's definitely value, and it's not always translatable into dollars, which makes it challenging. But yeah, I think that most folks in this functional kind of discipline would agree that the carry on or value or the potential value is very high for any type of external communications that we're able to do. So I'm a big advocate of really getting out there and getting things published and staying in the kind of public eye, the public being our community for these different magazines and news sources, because unless I think I said something earlier, unless it's really bad or unless it's a negative story or things like that, there's really not bad visibility if it's helping you to build a brand and get people interested and drive interest in sales. So.
Well, Stephen, I think that's great perspective on the very real ties between visibility and profitability. And I appreciate your acknowledgement that even though those ties might be somewhat indirect at times and perhaps difficult to quantify for people like you who might be working somewhat behind the scenes in a functional role, as you said, the value of consistent and positive messaging and visibility is huge. I don't think anybody is going to argue with you on that. However, you just said something at the end there about negative visibility, not typically being a concern. But it seems, at least to me, that the vast majority of the oil and gas industry's visibility could be described as negative. At least, once you move beyond the friendly confines of industry publications and conferences and networking groups, of course. But, even in industry-friendly arenas right now, it's not like the headlines about the realities of layoffs is necessarily positive. So, all that being said, as we begin to wrap up today, I'd like to move beyond the day-to-day work you've done for NOV and Gyrodata and get your opinion as someone who communicates for a living and who clearly has a passion for both paragraphs and petroleum, on how an industry that is so often demonized can best defend itself by using more effective communication strategies and by employing some of the same approaches and mindsets and tools that give individual companies like those that you've worked for, a real edge when it comes to boosting their visibility and in turn gaining the trust and the attention of their stakeholders.
I would say that as far as the point or the purpose of communication, written communication to what's happening in this industry right now, communications as a discipline is absolutely critical to kind of how we move forward because, yeah, like you said, it's really almost the oil and gas industry versus the world, I feel like at this point. And it's kind of us and then everything else is on the other side. And we do a pretty bad job of fighting this fight. I've always kind of thought that. Our PR efforts and ability to connect with the general populace and heck, even at times to connect with our own people in our companies and in our industry is sorely lacking. And so there's different approaches to it. The one I like the most is really kind of a twofold thing as far as highlight the good that we do. So things like natural gas that powers your home in the winter and the reliability of low cost, abundant energy and the transformation of human civilization over the past century on the back of hydrocarbons. And
you're saying that's a good thing, the transformation of humans. That's one of those positives, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think so. We're kind of figuring that out, but no, I mean, so that kind of stuff where it's worth highlighting that, right? Because that's not in the public view. All these ideas. If you talk to anybody in general and you say, what do you think about the oil industry? They're not going to say, well, thank goodness we don't operate via horse-drawn carriages anymore because we have gasoline-powered vehicles and transcontinental transportation primarily powered by gasoline and diesel. They're not going to say that. They're just going to say, man, oil and gas sucks. They're polluting the Arctic. They're killing animals everywhere. And so that's the challenge is this negativity is so deeply rooted and it's just been dealt with so kind of not ineffectively. I mean, I wasn't even a part of it at the time when all this was happening. So I don't want to criticize responses, but there hasn't been enough to really change public sentiment broadly. And so how can we not only highlight the good we do and then highlight the kind of human aspect or the stories of the people in this industry and really get that laser focus on what these people do and why they matter and how what they do is relevant to your life or to an industry at large or to things you enjoy, to your family, and certainly to them as they support their own family. And these are men and women that in many cases are operating in some of the most hazardous and dangerous environments on the planet, trying to extract the resources out of the planet that ultimately will kind of allow people to live their lives the way they live them. And I think in general, people don't really have any idea what that entails. And so that for me was certainly something I've wanted to do or tried to do is at least contribute to the discussion in getting an opinion out there or getting knowledge out there rather that what these men and women do to kind of make the circle go round and make everything kind of work and all the pieces of the puzzle just fit together because of the more kind of field or technical folks that are really running the business from that side. I also will take it kind of personally to myself because I'm a renewables and sustainability advocate. I mean, I put up something on LinkedIn a while back and I said, I take no pleasure in seeing renewable projects fail or hearing about delays or cost overruns or things like that. I'm on board, right? I mean, let's do this while recognizing that there's no kind of bizarre need to lambast oil and gas as an industry while simultaneously propping up renewables, because they're really kind of complementary, and they, at this point in time, one really can't exist without the other. And that too it's important to highlight, and people are very passionate on both sides. So how do you effectively bring these ideas into the conversation without getting people on the defensive? Wind farms kill birds. Well, that's not going to accomplish anything, right? I mean, that nobody's going to change their mind because of that about one side or the other. So it really needs to be more intelligent about how we approach this. Oh, wind turbines have to go into landfills. I mean, okay, that's fine too. I get it. I know this, right? But it's not gonna change anybody's opinion. Oil and gas people will hear that and say, yeah, those wind turbines have to go into landfills. And renewables people say, yeah, but think of all the carbon and the emissions, greenhouse gases, whatever. Think of everything we're changing by even having these things operate for 10, 20 years before we need to decommission them. It's worth it. It's worth this investment. And they're so entrenched in those positions that we really need to approach it more intelligently and I think more kind of decently and politely. That's what I generally try to do. I don't want to be hyper aggressive and try and aggravate people into changing their opinion. I don't think that works. So what we do as communicators in any form, written or podcasting like this or video interviews, things like that, for ones that aren't directly tied to an explicit kind of business purpose, it's always nice if there can be something in there about the value of what we do and how do we at least play our part in the conversation as the world kind of embraces the energy transition as a necessary thing, and how do we encourage them to support this changing world while also recognizing the criticality of what we do to that ongoing transition. That's my big thing.
Great. Well, one, there's no shortage of insight there, and certainly passion. And I guess really the only response I have to all that, Stephen, is have you considered just writing nice, balanced speeches for people as a pro bono exercise and then just leaving them for various influencers to hopefully pick up and share with the world? I mean, that sounds like it might be an avenue to get your thoughts out there to the public. Any thoughts around that?
I would certainly be open to kind of doing that. I've never really considered doing it as far as leaving something and saying, "Hey, here, take this. Please have it." I've kind of tried to do my part as far as things that I'll post or highlighting problematic articles or things like that. I mean, I think it was Bloomberg put up something the other day about BP turning green and Chevron being a terrible oil company, and they're so bad. And they had this picture of a yellow barrel in a forest, and it was rusting and leaking oil everywhere. I mean, it was a cartoon that I had to put that up and just say, what is this? Are we fundamentally confused about how oil is stored? There's no rusting oil barrel in the forest killing Mother Nature, but it's that kind of highly biased pandering that causes a lot of the problems that we have. So I've tried to do my part to combat it when reasonable and when I can, when I have a strong opinion. But yeah, never really thought if anybody would want my kind of words as their own. I'll do ghostwriting sometimes for people within the company for things like LinkedIn publisher posts and stuff like that. But I've never actually thought about really putting it out there in a more general way and finding maybe people that want to use it as their own or something like that. So certainly worth considering.
All right. Well, I look forward to following up on that endeavor here in a couple months and see if you've taken up the challenge of writing opinion pieces to be used by other people. So in the meantime, Stephen, I'd like to wrap up our chat by stepping away from the world of oil and gas and stepping away from discussion about your own content creation and finish by asking you if there are any pieces of literature from your educational days or anything that has nothing to do with anything that's going on today that people might want to pick up or you would recommend people pick up to escape perhaps the realities of 2020 and all that we're dealing with. What would you escape with that maybe somebody hasn't heard of, or is this maybe somewhat obscure and doesn't have any cliff notes that they can cheat with?
Oh gosh, I mean, heck, what I read might be worse than than the reality we live in. No, I mean, one of my favorite authors that I think is kind of academically known, but maybe not in a general sense, is Stendhal. He's a French author from the 1800s, just a phenomenal writer, really pioneering in the style of kind of I forgot exactly what they called it, but something along the lines of psychological writing, and really getting into the heads of characters and helping the reader understand, what they're thinking and articulating their ideas. And his book, it's called The Red and the Black, is kind of my favorite of his novels. Just a fantastic book. So definitely recommend that. Fairly obscure. There might be some cliff notes, I don't know, but that's one of my favorites. I'd also, just in this for the sake of going a little off the rails, definitely some Japanese literature that's well worth checking out. And some of them are very famous. I mean, there's ones that I've been reading like Kazuo Ishiguro or Haruki Murakami that maybe they're not household names, but decently well known and awarded in American publications. And then you can really go into the weeds with some other ones that like Natsume Soseki wrote a work called Kokoro, which means heart, and nobody's ever read this thing in America probably except some Japanese people and maybe me and some folks taking these kind of out there literature courses and whatnot. But I mean, Natsume Soseki, for example, he was actually on a Japanese yen currency, right? So that's how important that author was to them, was such that he was put on a piece of their paper currency. So that's a great book worth reading as well. And yeah, I could go on and on. That was a
that's a good starter list. It's a good starter list there. That's good.
Yeah, give that a try. I mean, Japanese lit was one of those things where I went really into it, and I had no reason to. I mean, I had a passing interest that became something more, and then I just read a whole bunch and barely touched it in my college education. But what I read is really more literature, for better or worse. So I've kind of avoided a lot of the things that people might, call pulp fiction or, more casual fiction things, the Clive Cusslers and, Stephen King's and things like that, where they're not like bad books or poorly written or anything like that. Baldacci and John Grisham, things like that. It's just that I've sought out reading as something to give me something. I want to take something for it. For me, reading was supposed to be an experience, and maybe that's from too many years in the college system, but I really wanted to learn something new or to glean something different about the world. And that's certainly something British Romanticism would argue, is that, in that sense, poetry, but extending that to anything, right? I mean, it should be providing you a new perspective or some kind of glimpse into the sublime or something that's bigger than you. So that's kind of why I look for things that might be a little more challenging or obscure in pursuit of that goal.
Well, great. Well, thank you for sharing some of those things with us. Obviously, we'll go ahead and link some of those up there in the show notes. So thank you for not just the book recommendations and the authors, and thanks for sharing your story and your insight and your perspective, and certainly for articulating the value of written communication, whether you're consuming it, as you just mentioned, or certainly whether you're producing it for the masses, as you do in your day job. So thank you for all of that. And certainly if someone wanted to pick your brain further or get a couple more obscure author recommendations, what would be the best way to get a hold of you, Stephen?
I mean, you can definitely find me and connect with me on LinkedIn. You can reach out to me at my Gyrodata email, which stephen.forrester@gyrodata.com. That's probably the two best areas. If I really need to, I can share my personal email if someone really wants to get into it. But those are the two that I probably use most often in a more professional way.
Well, Stephen, that all sounds great. And certainly I would encourage anyone who does want to engage further with Stephen to reach out to someone like him who is clearly not afraid to engage and share his thoughts and insights with a level of depth that, quite frankly, is not all that common in an age where headlines and one-liners and superficiality seems to dominate the communication landscape, so to speak. So, if you do reach out to Stephen, I can all but guarantee that you will at least get a paragraph or two back from him with the type of thoughtful responses he so generously shared with all of us today. So that being said, Stephen, thank you so much for coming on to the Energy Detox today and for candidly sharing your experiences and your unique perspective on the role of communication in the energy industry.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on and tell my story and let everybody know about the value of what we do, and certainly hope people make it through some of the more rambling answers I might have given. But it was a real pleasure, and no, thank you for having me on. It was really fun.
All right. Well, in post processing, maybe I'll add a couple sound effects in there just to keep people awake and keep their attention just in case. So
there you go, a little bit bop, here and there.
Well, in all seriousness, thanks again to you for answering all of my questions, and to the audience, for whom I have just one question today, which is, how might you be unwittingly damaging the odds of sustaining professional and personal success by undervaluing the importance of quality writing, as discussed by Stephen today? And as you ponder that, please allow me, your verbose yet incredibly grateful host, Joe Sinnott, to offer my continued thanks for listening to the Energy Detox podcast. And for more information about the show and about the work I do helping energy industry leaders take charge of writing their own success stories, please visit theenergydetox.com. And until next time, I propose you remember two things. One, that there is nothing you do in your personal and professional lives that displays your intellect more than your writing. And I promise that any extra energy you invest in writing more thoughtfully and effectively, even at times when the audience is just yourself, will push you closer to peak performance. And two, just because writing is by far the best way for us humans to capture, refine, and articulate our thoughts, you do not need to be a perfect writer with pristine grammar to begin seeing what happens when you put just a little bit more focus on your written communication. In fact, the famous author Ernest Hemingway once said, "There is no rule on how to write. Sometimes it comes easily and perfectly. Sometimes it's like drilling rock and then blasting it out with charges." Thanks again.